Hello, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. And yes, Christine.
Arunava, wait 1 second. I will tell you, but I speak 1 second.
Sure. I do believe we have an audience now.
It's coming, it's coming.
Yes. No, that's fine.
Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm very delighted to welcome all of you to this Café Philosophie, Café Philo, as part of the Generation Equality Forum. Tonight, we have an exceptional panelist, 5 women and 1 man. Thank you so much, Arunava Sina, as a moderator. And we will welcome in a few minutes Sylvie Lebon de Beauvoir, who is philosopher and Simone de Beauvoir's adopted daughter. We have another young philosopher, Divya Dwivedi, Marine Rouge, historian, Adi Maheshwari, publisher from Vani Prakashan, Monica Singh, famous translator, Hindi translator of The Second Sex, and Arunava. Thank you, all of you, for joining us tonight. And I'm very, very pleased to welcome all of you in this in this framework of the book release of Les Inséparables, the Inseparables. Thank you so much. Arunava, it's your turn.
Thank you, Christine. Hello, everyone. And it's a rare honor to be in such august company. And I'm just hoping that this evening my role will be limited to asking the occasional question, but mostly I hope to be able to listen and learn from all of you. We will be joined very soon by Sylvie, but we have been talking earlier, and I think we can start in any case because Sylvie and we have had some conversations and she has already sent us some responses to the questions we wanted to ask her. So if that's all right with everyone, I'm going to request Monica, who is currently translating Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex into Hindi, and it must be a truly monumental project, Monica. So I'm going to request Monica to perhaps give us the answers that Sylvie has already sent on ahead. And as soon as she can join us, we will move on to her and talk to her directly. So Sylvie was, she was a student when she happened to write to Simone de Beauvoir, taken up by her work. And I dare say that she was surprised, astonished when she got a response. And that was the beginning of an incredible relationship that also included, among other things, Sylvie's becoming Simone de Beauvoir's adopted daughter, traveling with her extensively, and indeed becoming a philosopher in her own right. So we asked Sylvie what those early years were like. The first encounter with Simone de Beauvoir, she was already aware of her stature. So how did that affect her experience of talking to her? And what was her learning in all the time that they spent together? Monica, you're muted.
Sorry. Okay, so I'm just going to read out the response Sylvie had sent us. She's having some connection problem. I met Simone de Beauvoir when I was studying in Paris. I had read everything that had appeared about her at the time and had written to her of my admiration, especially for her novel Les Mandarins. She always answered students, especially those studying philosophy, and she gave me a first appointment. I was very impressed by her popularity, of course, but she knew how to make you feel at ease and we had a deep affinity. The age difference between us never mattered. Several years passed. I entered the École Normale. I passed the aggregation in philosophy. I met her from time to time. Then, more often, our relationship deepened. She shared with me what she was experiencing, small and big events, her readings, political and literary debates of the time. Little by little, she really brought me into her life, into her friend circle, introduced me to Sartre, to her close ones, to the journal Les Temps Modernes, and we traveled together a lot in Europe and in Mexico, among other places. At the end of the summer, we always came back to Rome to stay with Sartre. A rare thing was that she always gave more than she promised. The warmth of her friendship gave me confidence. Her vitality, her demands, and her indulgence inspired and stimulated me. I was aware of the miracle of being there, of which she spoke so well, the miracle of her presence. We talked about everything. She loved when I asked questions and asked me questions all the time. She did not see herself as an example to follow, nor did she, nor did she give you lessons. But her very touch, she made you understand that you should not imitate, you should invent your own life, take it into your own hands, and yet it was the living example of what she was and did that worked. I reflected on our conversations. I came back to them and thought about them again, especially when something surprised me, shook me up, even shocked me, because we are all first bathed in prejudices. She spoke to me as an equal, and my admiration for her taste for truth and her courage, an admiration that only strengthened and grew, was the most powerful incentive, support, and happiness.
Thank you. At this point, I would have been asking Sylvie about the new novel, The Inseparables, how she discovered the manuscript and what it was like when she started work on it. And while we are still trying to patch her in, let me move to Divya. And Divya, ask you, you're familiar with this new work that Sylvie has been that has pulled out and is put into publication in French, and an English translation is due out later this year. So would you like to tell us a little bit about where this book stands in relation to her other works, Simone de Beauvoir's other works, other literary works, indeed to her philosophy, and anything else that you'd like to bring in here? Divya, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you, Arunava. And first of all, good evening to everyone. And thank you to the French Institute and especially Christine Cornet for gathering all of us around this newly published but old writing of Simone de Beauvoir. And it is, I think, something we experience as an adventure, because with this publication and with other recent publications of Simone de Beauvoir's letters, over the past 1 or 2 decades, other manuscripts, all of which is thanks to the efforts of Sylvie Le Bon de Beauvoir. We find ourselves in the midst of unceasing discoveries of other Beauvoirs who continue to change before our eyes, and for whom all the labels with which we used to think about her, especially as an existentialist, as a feminist of a certain period, all of them fall short. And I call them discoveries because what we find as the total effect of this series of confrontations with her new writings is a gift of a voluptuous intelligence. And I say that because even in her own writings, many of which are one or the other form of self-writing, the many autobiographies, the diaries, and the letters themselves that are now coming out, she was also describing herself. She was looking for ways to characterize her project or her projects. And we also know that many of her novels, including this one, Les Inséparables, the Inseparables, can be treated as roman à clef. That is to say, full of characters who have been taken from her own life, including herself, perhaps sometimes split into different characters, and many of the struggles, the quests that are undertaken there can be recognized in relation to her life. But I would like to propose that in these writings, especially the literary writings, we find things that far exceed any of these characterizations, including self-characterizations by the Beauvoir. And instead, I'd like to take a phrase that she had used in 1964, and it's very telling because it was in the midst of a lecture, Que peut la littérature? What can literature do? And in it, she tries to show the intimate relationship, I would even say the inseparability of literature and philosophy. And I think something of that is there in this early novel. It was written in 1954, so it was written after The Second Sex, which is what she's still mostly known for. And it was also written after her prize-winning novel, The Mandarins, Les Mandarins. And what we find in this lecture is this phrase, le goût d'une autre vie. And she says that literature is a zone of risk in which both the author and the reader risk themselves by entering into another person's life, another person's point of view or situation, and it gives us a taste of another life. And I find that in these successive discoveries or unconcealments of Beauvoir herself, we are also tasting another life. And indeed, what we find is Beauvoir's own taste to become another life, to constantly become something other than she is. And therefore, we could say that she has a vocation not for one singular voice, so that we can't look for Beauvoir's own voice, but that she had a taste for many voices and even a passion for changing her skin, to grow new skins so that she could touch the world and be touched by it. And in these series of books, perhaps we begin to gain a great distance, maybe even a necessary distance, a provisional distance from her confirmed status as the mother of feminisms, even the feminisms which departed from her, which contested her legacy and critiqued her ideas. And this is something that another philosopher, Julia Kristeva, said in 2009 when she was paying homage to this book, The Second Sex. And with this phrase, mother of feminisms, we definitely think of second sex as the birth of a new kind of mother, a mother who does not simply reproduce and nurture her progeny, but a mother who bears freedom itself. She nurtures freedom for other people and for herself. But I would say that with the birth of this book, Les Inséparables, we find yet a new Beauvoir who's born. And this is one who I would not call a mother. I would rather call her the perpetual child. And I think we'll have more time in the course of this evening to talk more about exactly why I speak like this about this novel. But we do know one thing, which is that it's a novel about a phase of youth, which is just after infancy, infancy as a period when one is dependent entirely on one's family, and on the threshold of a period that is yet to arrive, which is of adulthood, which for men would promise freedoms in Beauvoir's time, but for women, it only promised a series of obligations that were imposed on women. And Beauvoir's intense and sensitive focus into this zone is as it were trying to excavate what it means to remain a perpetual child. And we do know that this novel too was modeled closely after her own relationship in her youth with her friend Zaza. And Zaza is someone who also struggled to try to convert the zone of perpetual childhood into something like a promised freedom, but it was an unsuccessful struggle. And Zaza died in the end, much the way that André dies in this novel. And so perhaps in this novel, it's not Beauvoir looking for her own freedom. It is rather Beauvoir, through the character of Sylvie, trying to witness the struggle for freedom that these two girls, young girls, share together. Again, if Sylvie were here, Sylvie Le Bon, I would have liked to ask her some questions, but maybe when she joins us.
Arunava, you are muted. Arunava, muted.
Is there a chance we can connect to Sylvie on speakerphone?
We try to do, yeah, we try to.
Marine, you were going to try and do that?
Christine s'en occupe finalement de leur côté.
Okay. So while you do that, we can continue the conversation a little bit more. Does anyone have a response in the meantime to what Divya said? Do you have a question of her? Marine, maybe? Yes, Aditi? Unmute yourself first, please.
I'd just like to take from where Divya left and just add a strand of understanding on how Simone de Beauvoir changed the entire spectrum of understanding a female in the Indian popular consciousness. So in 1992, Dr. Prabha Khaitan, who was a leading feminist writer, poet of Hindi, she produced a translation, an abridged translation of The Second Sex. And this book is called Stri Upekshita, and it was supported by the French Book Office in 1992. And this book became such an iconic masterpiece, because here was a text that appeared for the first time in Hindi language that shifted the entire focus of an understanding of a woman's body, her role in society. The entire being of physiology to the entire being that is a product of a conditioning. So once that window comes in, once that ontology and epistemology of conditioning comes in, we are able to question so many things in Hindi literature itself. It opens so many windows. So although we have been trying to convince Gallimard, the publisher of Simone de Beauvoir's writings, to please look into this special case, because Dr. Prabha Khaitan's book is an abridged translation. But the iconic status that book has for the Hindi audience, Simone de Beauvoir is available to us and has opened a new watershed of writing, feminist writing, in the new liberal India, in a liberal India where women were earning their own bread and butter. We are talking about 1992 here. So that's Simone de Beauvoir for me, because when I went to university, Hindi mein, if I'm allowed to use just a sentence, it just says very simply, स्त्री जन्म नहीं लेती, स्त्री बनाई जाती है, which means that a woman is not born, a woman is created. She is a product of creation and orientation. So that just, I'm sure Divya, because she works on ontologies of philosophy, she would understand what kind of watershed moment this would have been for the body of literature here. And then now that we are looking at, with support of the French Book Office in India, the Pap Tagore program, Monica Singh ji has given us time to translate these two heavy duty books, chapter by chapter, line by line, into Hindi language, which again is a monumental task. I think from 1992 to 2001, this book has traveled a very long journey, has traveled generations, and has changed generations of hands, and has influenced generation of writings. So as far as the Hindi public sphere is concerned, Simone de Beauvoir, I wish Sylvie joins us soon, because she must be narrated this entire epic story of how she has influenced a decade, 3-decade-old feminists of our part of the world.
Yes, thank you, Aditya. And I really hope that the book gets translated into India's other non-English languages as well, and soon. Yeah. Marine?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Aditi, for pointing out the question of translation and reception, because the question of translation is very linked with the question of reception, because translation has the power to determine reception, and the reception of a work is function of its translation, but also the context and the particular environment that will determine at least in parts, the readings and processes of appropriations. And feminist translation studies have been working on the second sex now for many years. And what comes out of those research is very important to understand how the second sex has been influencing women and feminists from all over the world. So I think the second sex is a very interesting case study, and having it translated into a new, into Hindi a second time is a beautiful project.
Monica, what are your expectations from this new translation? Will you unmute yourself, please?
We all forget. As Aditi said that an abridged translation was available, yeah, but still I'm hoping that, as she said, that I'm going to translate direct from French to Hindi and line by line. And so I'm hoping that we are going to reach to a much larger population this time. India is a very, very big country, and I feel the Hindi belt really needs to read. Hindi belt means the states, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, how women are treated and their lives today. It has to change. They have to bring the change. So they have to read and they have to take the decision. So I would hope that we reach to this audience and they can read, they can start thinking and changing their destiny.
Thank you. We'd asked Sylvie about what she thinks Simone de Beauvoir means to today's generation of young feminists. And maybe that's a question that we can take up now and have everybody participate in. I'd love to hear, I want to learn from you, Marine, what you think as a PhD student now, from Divya, of course, what it means for you as a professor of philosophy and literature, from Aditi as a publisher, and from Monica as someone who's reading her work so closely as a translator. So maybe we'll start with Marine.
Yeah, okay. Yes, so from a historical point of view, Beauvoir and her work have always had an influence on feminist movements. And with the Second Sex that was published in 1949, she proposed what we call a new politics of sexuality, and it is this politics that was widely commented. It is important to say that Simone de Beauvoir did not have an influence only on the second wave of feminism of the 70s. Her work was interpreted by feminists during the 50s and during the 60s in France, but also all over the world at diverse degrees. And those decades paved the way for second wave feminism. But that said, the kind of influence she had was not a direct one. I would say that it was much more like an inspiration. Many feminists did not agree with her, and yet she was part of their life. And many of them had read Beauvoir's The Second Sex or the memoirs as teenagers, and those books have opened new possibilities for them. And as for the influence on the younger feminist generation, I think I would use the same word. It's an inspiration. It is not an example, because an example is supposed to be followed quite strictly. And Beauvoir's philosophy makes an important point in becoming oneself, in becoming a singularity, as Sylvie writes it in her introduction to Les Inséparables. So she did not expect to be taken as a model or as an example, although in many cases she was and she is. But it's very interesting because I've been talking about this very recently with an American philosopher. She said to me, and she wrote, her name is Sky Cleary. that it would not do justice to Beauvoir's thinking to do this. So we can and we do, as feminists, think with and around Beauvoir. That's all what I can say for the feminist.
Thank you. Divya, would you?
Yes, I think what Marine has said is very true of every reader anywhere of Simone de Beauvoir, that it's a relationship of inspiration, also of resonance. And I think when I mentioned Kristeva, this is also what she was saying, because she belonged to the generation, she, Lou Siri-Carré and Nsexu, who, as it were, had rebelled against some aspects of the way in which Beauvoir had analyzed gender. And at the same time, Kristeva affirms that it was this very battle, a necessary battle that provides a kind of mutual freedom. And it is in the sense that anyone who is inspired by or talks to the second sex is going to experience new questions for our own times. So it is not a question of implementing Beauvoir or applying Beauvoir to our times. And two things are quite important when we look at this text that was written in the middle of the last century by a woman who grew up in the early part of the last century, and us as readers of this text today. And the first is that she was one of the first women to struggle and try and establish a place for herself to live, to think, and to create in a domain that was very male, which did not even offer the same possibilities for a woman as a philosopher, which perhaps could be one of the reasons why you find in some of her writings statements such as she's not a philosopher. And in other writings, her confession that all her writings, including her literary works, are stamped by philosophy because she has no other way of feeling the world. So these constraints in which she developed her writing also led to perhaps a constraint that she would have to speak in a voice, in a language that was shared by the rather male milieu of philosophy around her. And that's why I urge all of us to read her more closely, because there is something underneath that voice. Voice is not all that we should be led by while reading her, nor her own declarations. And so we know that she was also trying to craft a position for herself. And I would even say perhaps echoing Milan Kundera in the way he talked about Goethe, that Simone de Beauvoir too was an administrator of her own immortality. She was crafting the way in which she would sound alongside other philosophers. She was also using a shared terminology from existentialism, from phenomenology, and especially from a Hegel who had been received in the France of that time through the lectures of Alexandre Kojève. And this is true not only of Beauvoir's own generation, but of the generation of philosophers and feminists that came after her, like Lacan, Althusser, Foucault. And so there is only one part of this picture, which is an intergenerational struggle. The other part is, in fact, the very probing manner in which she questioned the assumptions of Hegel's master-slave dialectic. And we know that this was an inspiration itself for anti-colonial thinkers, particularly Frantz Fanon. And here you begin to see the history of resonances and inspirations of Beauvoir. For instance, Fanon had a copy of The Second Sex in his own library, and it was much underlined. And the kind of problem that he discovered with respect to race and colonialism in the master-slave dialectic was, you could say, a counterpart of the kind of problem that Beauvoir had discovered with respect to gender and the master-slave dialectic. So these were two ways of interrogating a Hegel that had simply been taken for granted by other contemporary philosophers. And here you see how she was beyond, way beyond her own time. To put it very briefly, what she pointed out was that this dialectic of two consciousnesses who are equal and equally struggling for recognition from each other is going to end in the subordination of one or the other. But she showed that it was conceived in its full abstractness and universalism as a struggle that could not comprehend the experience and the condition of women. And that's why you could not simply have a feminist theory or a feminist anthropology, which is there in Second Sex, but you needed to have a new interrogation of the history of philosophy itself. And this point should be remembered today when we find women in other parts of the world, including India, and not just women, but other groups of people who also find themselves marginalized, like LGBTQIA+, who find that there is something about the established discourses that somehow does not comprehend the realities of their lives and the new inventions that are necessary for them to gain their freedoms. In one light, then Simone de Beauvoir herself might seem like an outdated thinker, a feminist who was ultimately speaking only about white women's experience. And I think this is a legitimate criticism of Beauvoir. But on the other hand, when we see how decolonialist feminists in Latin America have questioned the male decolonialist philosophers, or the way in which Dalit feminists have also provided a wide-ranging interrogation of upper caste feminisms as well as of patriarchies of all kinds, you see that something of what Simone de Beauvoir had inaugurated is continuing. It may not always happen in direct confrontation with her writing, but it is that same spirit for looking for freedom, for inventing new concepts to comprehend new realities, and very close to her own experience, including her love and companionship with Sylvie Le Bon, to look for to imagine other relationships, including with other women.
Thank you. I'm very tempted to pick up on a cue that's being put insistently in the chat box, where a very vibrant conversation is going on, by the way. But you can choose to take it up now or later. But the point is, what about men? What do men have to learn from Simone de Beauvoir? And I think it's a very important question. Is it something you'd like to talk about now?
Yeah, actually, yeah. Even men should read. Somebody said that why only women? Why? The first thing, why women? Because women have to start thinking that when they are born, they are conditioned and they are told by the families, by the society that they have to behave in a certain way and all that. So it's just that by reading this book, they can start thinking other way, that they don't have to follow the lines. Men also have to men should read to see that what they have been doing to women through all these through ages. They should read also. Yeah.
Thank you. Marine?
Sorry. Yes, I can talk about this from my experience in reading the letters Simone de Beauvoir received from the 40s to her death in 1986. Just to a few words about the context. Simone de Beauvoir received thousands of letters each year from her public, and among the letters written by friends, intellectuals, and several institutions, there are the letters written by women who are struggling in their lives and who are seeking advice, help, and comfort from Simone de Beauvoir. And what I saw in this collection of about 20,000 letters is that the letters from women are the majority. It doesn't mean that men are not interested in Simone de Beauvoir's work. It just means that the reception from men and from women is different. And Simone de Beauvoir, in fact, when I read the testimonies from those women, I realized that the book, The Second Sex, played the role of an awakener, but in a particular way, because the book, The Second Sex, did not allow them to realize their condition, because those who wrote Simone de Beauvoir already felt those contradictions, the contradictions linked to their condition. But The Second Sex made it possible to feel the belonging to a larger group. And reading The Second Sex has provided for the first time to these isolated women the story of a common experience. And in fact, what they realized in reading The Second Sex is that they were no longer alone. So it's a question of context and of the domination of men from men on women, and the reception between men and women cannot be the same in this context. But I'm talking about the reception in the 40s and 50s and 60s and then 70s. The context has changed, and as Monica said, reading The Second Sex is important both for men and women.
Well, yeah, I mean, going by some of the violent patriarchal responses one sees on social media, I'm not so sure that the situation is very different for men in India, for example, now compared to men in Europe in the 1960s or 70s. Aditi?
Just wanted to add to what Mary just underlined. It's not only about the decades of reading Simone de Beauvoir's works, it's also about, for example, in our country, with the multilingual fabric that we all live in. So the reception of Simone de Beauvoir's works in Indian languages, how they are, how the work is experienced, is made is turned into a vehicle to express that experience. I think that would be very interesting to see. I think this book, for the first time underlined the male gaze. It's for the first time that this book put a spotlight on this whole idea of an external gaze. And then we have Julia Kristeva, of course, much later in Ecritus Papers. She goes on to push the envelope a little harder towards just breaking the gender binaries and making it even more fluid for us to understand what this gaze does to the whole concept of gender. But I think this book remains iconic even after decades of publication, is because it gave us a tool to point out that this gaze has to be dealt with. It is not right. And I think we are a fan club here talking about Simone de Beauvoir's work. I mean, we all know that Monica Singh is an award-winning translator. She got the prestigious Romola Award, and I'm just hoping that when this translation comes out through her desk, it would just fly. I mean, look at my excitement already. So that's where we are.
No, that's really infectious, that excitement at the thought of a new translation coming out. Monica, you wanted to respond, and then back to Marine after that. Monica, did you want to say something? Your hand icon is up. You're mute.
By mistake.
Okay.
My cursor is moving on its own. I don't know.
All right, Marine.
Yes, just a reading recommendation, because on this subject of men and submission of women and subjectivity, etc., there's the very interesting book by Manon Garcia, who has just been translated into English. It's called We Are Not Born Submissive, and I think it can help thinking through all this issue the relationship between men and women in a context of domination, and how it acts both on women's lives, but also on men's lives. That's all.
Thank you. We'd also asked Sylvie what her own philosophical views are on feminism today, and how she thinks Simone de Beauvoir's work is important for today's young people. So Monica, maybe the last two questions, would you like to read the answers, if you could? Questions 4 and 5. You'll have to unmute yourself, sorry.
Sorry. I think that feminism is one of the great revolutionary movements of this century. The second sex, which deals with the condition of half of humanity, seems to me to be comparable to the other great emancipatory works, such as that of the philosopher Kant for knowledge, of Marx for the analysis of work, Copernicus, Galileo, or Darwin for scientific thought. An irreversible change has been achieved in the way women are viewed. But despite significant achievements in some countries, much remains to be done to ensure that women are recognized everywhere entirely as human beings. Regressions and setbacks appear here and there. Feminism still has many enemies, including among women. But how can we deny the scandal of their oppression? And then what she means to the young feminists. She says, Sylvie de Beauvoir, I think I've already answered this question implicitly. Feminism has a social and political side. It is an essential fight to conquer power, rights, equality, and visibility in society. There is no such thing as feminine nature. A woman should not be granted anything because she is a woman, nor should she be denied anything because she is a woman. But more profoundly, it is a fight for freedom in the philosophical sense, which concerns every human individual. It is the fight for personal autonomy. Of course, it primarily concerns the second sex, but it also concerns men as much as women, who are prisoners and victims of stereotypes and roles that they have not chosen. It is therefore no longer just a fight against others, but often against oneself, for authenticity, against all the temptations of ease, comfort, security, consensus. And this fight is the most difficult because it lasts as long as our existence. And it is repeated in every generation. It has no end, which is what makes the human condition so valuable. That's what Sylvie Le Bon de Beauvoir answered to what Simone de Beauvoir means to today's generation of young feminists.
Thank you. Yes, I understand that she's not able to connect, but at least we're grateful in that we've managed to find out what her thoughts are. And there's an interesting point being made, and maybe Divya, you might want to take this on. Somebody is asking, pointing out that we tend to think in this context of both women and men as a single category each, that there's no differentiation in between. So oppressors versus the oppressed versus the perpetrators, as it were. So how do we read de Beauvoir to deconstruct this notion?
That's a really important question. I stopped speaking the last time at the point where we could say that, as some of her readers have said, that de Beauvoir herself, on the one hand, seemed to have written a large part of the second sex in terms of a dyadic opposition between men and women, and what is imposed on women. But on the other hand, many of her other writings, her own life, which is testified in so many of her books and her letters, show that she was in fact exploring something like a lesbian connection or a spectrum in which one was not at all confined by pre-existing gender identities, because of the kind of struggle that one could undertake. But how do we then read Simone de Beauvoir outside of these dyadic oppositions? Here, I think we also have to read her in a different way outside of the group of philosophers by whom she's always been surrounded in her reception. This is something that's happened more and more in recent scholarship, to read her next to Hegel or next to Kant or phenomenology or Heidegger. But although she was using the terminology of the self and other, which is very dyadic, and which seems to leave only these two options: either I am annihilated as an object for the other, or I confront the other as a consciousness whom I have to annihilate. And sure enough, her first novel, She Came to Stay, La Vité, seems to dramatize this kind of a struggle between something which is two. But on the other hand, in her other writings, we begin to see that she's increasingly preoccupied by what she called a situation. And I think she had extended an exploration of situatedness beyond her other contemporaries. This is testified in the second sex because we should remember that it's a project in which she was inspired by the grand work of Gunnar Myrdal, which was on racism in the American context. And she said that this was such a comprehensive and exhaustive work that is the kind of thing she wanted to do also for gender, for women. So she was already aware of other struggles happening elsewhere. And we know that from the 60s onwards, she was traveling. She also admitted frequently her ignorance of many struggles that were going on in other parts of the world. So she was on a project of continuously, overcoming this ignorance, changing her perspectives, and trying to look at a situation in a trying to comprehend the situation, which means an awareness of the different components that composed it. For instance, culture, labor, gender, capitalism, colonialism, nationalisms, which she was also fighting, anti-Semitism. But at the same time, she became increasingly aware that to try and comprehend a situation in this way would lead to a totality. And in fact, in the same lecture on literature and philosophy that I mentioned earlier in 1964, she uses yet another very telling phrase, which is that what she was seeking to articulate through philosophy as well as literature, and also her political writings, was a totality that was detotalized. And this, I think, is an extremely important point for us to sense the openness towards other struggles than between man and woman. Because what does it mean for a totality to be detotalized? What kind of perspective is she asking us to adopt philosophically? I think here she was really going far beyond the phenomenological perspective of the I, the first person perspective, for which in her early part of life, she had experienced even a kind of struggle against solipsism. But by speaking of situation as something detotalized, what she was on the verge of discovering was the possibility where we change the given system. And how do we do that? We begin to look for those spaces, those corners where we invent something. Of course, these inventions will once again turn into components that will be comprehended by another totality. But I think she had already glimpsed the fact that it will cease to be totalized. And this is the reason why I speak of the voluptuousness of Simone de Beauvoir, because voluptuousness here means that we find in her an intelligence that was, stretching herself in all directions to try and taste every morsel of existence, to try to know about every part of existence, and hence her, voracious reading, and also her voracious love for everything that she came to know about, the very loves that characterize her own life, including, her many friendships. And it reveals then to us her vision of us as both the matter for freedom, the matter which is capable of hosting new regularities, of hosting new inventions, of being legislated otherwise. And on the other hand, ourselves also as the freedom which invents these new legislations. It's something that the philosopher Shaj Mohan and I call polynomia, which simply means the existence and the possibility of existence of multiple laws of our own invention. And I think this applies equally in the case of gender, to come back to the more precise question that was raised, that there is no given of male versus female, just as there is no given, phenomenologically speaking or existentially speaking, of the self and the other. And all these dyadic oppositions, which I think belong to a way of philosophizing in the past, had already been outstripped by her. So that I would say, coming back for a moment to this novel, Les Inséparables, which in the past 1 year has often been called a coming of age novel, just I think because it takes age in a rather sociological manner. I would say that it defies age. It shows that Simone de Beauvoir's thinking does not belong to any age. It's still producing new ages for us, new times for us. But it can only happen in the way we become inventive, in the way in which we become both the means and the ends of this other freedom.
Thank you. There are 2 or 3 very interesting points being made, and I'm going to bring them up and maybe seek responses from you. Think of these as interventions. Question for you specifically, Monica. Is it possible to have this translation not necessarily as a word-to-word rendition, but according to our social structure, connotative, denotative reference?
I don't know what I read this message on the chat. Word to word. What does he mean when he says word to word?
No, I think the point Aditi was making was that you're translating the entire text and not an abridged version.
Yeah.
I think
because
that was
it's
the
in 2
reference to
parts.
it.
Well,
so,
no, we have to understand that I have to be faithful to what she wanted to communicate. It's not my writing. If I have to write something, I'll write, I'll take another platform, I'll write in a magazine, wherever, I'll take my time. But here I have been asked to translate. I have no right to change a single word, a single thought. And that's why translating literature books takes a lot of time, because there are times when we have to sit with a sentence, with a phrase from morning to evening, just to enter the mind of the writer. So we just I cannot do, add anything, because the message was that, what was it? I remember.
It was about whether, the way I read it is whether you can change the frame of reference to make it, I don't know, maybe more quote Indian unquote, or more in line with the third decade of the 21st century.
Well, there are people like, there are philosophers, there are researchers. Divya has been, explaining it so well. So it's their job to throw light upon things written by great writers, interpret it, explain it in the given time with the contemporary, whatever the problem is. Because my job is to say what she wanted to say. I'm just conveying it in another language. Right. Isn't it?
Yes, of course. All right, I'm going to read an exchange between 3 people, and they all are on the same theme. So maybe one of you would like to, or more of than one of you would like to respond. So the first person says, that's also with reference to something that was probably being spoken about at the time. That's also due to the lack of representation of other genders. And if we don't include them in our discussion, the majority groups will continue to outweigh the rest. Someone else says, by excluding them, we are further marginalizing identities that don't fit into these categories. Inclusion is enabling for all and distributes power more equally. Otherwise, it creates more levels of perpetuating marginalization, like one can see in the case of Savarna feminism in South Asia. And finally, a third person says, and I don't think we can confirm a particular group as a minority, especially when the quote, heteronormative unquote majority has not had the opportunity or the social space or acceptance to explore themselves. A lot of heterosexual men and women could be non-binary in secret. So the term sexual quote minorities unquote itself is ambiguous. So as I said, a very vibrant discussion going on. And would Marine and Divya like to respond? Do you have thoughts about this?
Yeah, I think Divya is more qualified to respond in terms of philosophy, but I think it's an essential conversation. I'm not a specialist of those questions, but I know there are scholars working on this. For example, reading Beauvoir through masculinity studies, through trans feminism, through gay and lesbian studies, and also through post-colonial studies. But again, I'm not a philosopher, but as I was listening to Divya earlier, I was wondering if the key to this issue would be phenomenology. Beauvoir was a phenomenologist, and she described women's lived experience to better understand their condition. Maybe we can extend this methodological approach to other experiences and to question the the belonging to a certain groups or the experience, etc. But again, I prefer to let Divya respond to this question.
Divya?
Thank you for your response, Marine. In fact, there's something I'd like to ask you later, which has to do with Second Sex, its translations and the abridged and full version, which I think relates to this. Or maybe let's start with it, because it's a question of inclusion and exclusion, of the coexistence of many voices, but in which hierarchy, in what kinds of equations. We know that the big problem with the first translation into English of the Second Sex was that it had been abridged. And what had suffered in this abridgment was all the long passages in which Simone de Beauvoir had explicated her views on other philosophers, including male philosophers, but primarily on women thinkers, and also long passages where she had been citing other women writers and thinkers and scholars. And that, of course, tells us something about the way in which her book then, acquires the appearance of a greater monotony than it, in fact, it had. It was a book that was teeming with other women's voices, with other people's voices. And one of those voices was Virginia Woolf, who herself had written experimentally in so many novels as well as non-fictional works about this problem of exclusion, not just of women as women, but of these other possibilities of inventing, other experiences of the body, experiencing other identities, other gender identities, other practices of love, other meanings of love. So as far as Simone de Beauvoir's own, quest is concerned, I think there is a lot more to think along with her because of these possibilities, and not only in Hindi, but I would say in many other Indian languages, which must be included, not to be confined to a language that is spoken by and large by North Indian people, and is also sought to be proposed as the national language, which I think is very unfair. In all languages, we need to have this experience. But we also see that for Simone de Beauvoir, the very reason why there is no simplistic dyad of male and female, it's also the reason why she struggled very intensely to see how does inclusion take place, because inclusion by itself is not a solution to problems. Another kind of research that I have done together with Shaj Mohan and J. Raghu in the recent times has been to show how sometimes religious categories like Hindu have been constructed in order to artificially include people and therefore to misrepresent them. So inclusion itself is something that we have to interrogate. And what is needed in this case is, in fact, for people to be able to bring their own pasts, their different experiences into a conversation. So it would not then simply be a new first person or even a phenomenological account, although I think that that's necessary, as you said, Marine. And that's why I feel that if we were to read Simone de Beauvoir with new eyes, then we would be forced to leave aside many of these isms or schools of thought of the last century. We would actually need to develop new terms for what she had been doing, terms beyond the ones that she had given for herself. And that's why it's important to remember something that she said elsewhere in a conversation again on literature and philosophy, and I'll try to see if I can read it out because it's in French. C'est ça le miracle de la littérature, c'est qu'une vérité autre devient mienne, sans cesser d'être autre. J'abdique mon jeu en faveur de celui qui parle, et pourtant je reste moi-même. That is to say that this is the miracle of literature, and maybe we could say writing in general, and even philosophy, that it's another truth, the truth of another becomes mine without ceasing to be other. That's the kind of conversation that she was also trying to bring in the way she represented dialogues in her narratives. And I think another whole evening will be required to talk about the narrative techniques, the literary techniques through which she was trying to enter another person's voice. And I think this included not just male and female. It's an invitation to become other oneself. And that's what I also mean by her passion for becoming something other, for being born as something other ceaselessly, or in other words, to be a perpetual child. And she says that I renounce my I. This renunciation is what is not possible in phenomenology in the way we have come to receive it. It's also not possible merely through a deconstruction of the given situations, no matter how comprehensively we try to describe them. But rather what is needed is that we do something both with new thoughts and with new writing. And that's also why she speaks of literature as an action. And she does so in a way that is very different from the way Sartre did it in his book called What is Literature, where he also tried to connect literature to politics and to being committed. So I think the question that highlights the problems with what is called Savarna feminism is an extremely important one, because it shows that there are still many battles to be fought. Neither can, one religious category subsume the realities, the pasts, the experiences of different groups of people in India, nor can, one feminism or even feminism alone be sufficient for everyone. And for those who will be tempted to read Les Inséparables, once it's available in English, I think in a few months, it will be something to also consider why the male character in the novel, Blondel, why he too is trapped in his own situation. And in fact, these are not bubbles isolated from each other. These three friends, the two girls and this young man, all of them are trying together to look for a way towards their mutual freedom. And I would like to stop at this last point, which is why I feel that this first person point of view is insufficient. I think we all, from our own situations, may have different struggles, but others' struggles are equally ours. We don't have to speak on the behalf of other people, and we don't have to speak while they remain silent. We have to hunt out all these problems where people still remain unheard or unpublished or silenced, but we have to fight with each other. So I think the fight for freedom is a fight that we undertake together across our differences. But the miracle is when we are willing to leave our I aside. And that's what I mean by her ability to shatter her own mirrors and to, slub off the skin that she was wearing at any particular time.
Thank you. Yes, Aditi?
Just a couple of points I'd like to respond to with what Mary and what Divya just spoke about. So as far as the soul politics of reception and translation is concerned, I think Mary very importantly underlined that it is as much a translator's prerogative as it is the prerogative of the author in the original language, the original text. So thank you, Mary, for underlining this fact. And when Divya just spoke about how a populist consciousness, I'm not verbatimly reproducing what she said, but I'm just trying to understand. As far as the populist appropriation of a text is concerned, here the language of the majority of North Indians, quote unquote, you see the consciousness is the driver here. The consciousness made it possible for a feminist author in 90s to think about a text and to bring it to the Indian audience. Of course, a lot of some of the texture from that text is missing because the length and the breadth of the project, I was very young. I don't know what happened at that time. But as I, for example, put out the news of this program today, there are about 3 generations of readers who are getting in touch with me, who are trying to ask, where is Dr. Prabha Khetan's translation now? Because it is being read in photocopies at the university. Everyone has a photocopy of Sri Upekshita, but no one has an original copy. So I really wish, Divya, I really wish, Mary, we could think of a way to keep this iconic translation alive in some way. I do understand that with monumental work that cannot be touched as Simone de Beauvoir's, any kind of abridgment is come, I mean, it does come with a peril. But I really wish, as a publisher, as a reader, as a student who has known Simone in the classroom, I really wish Dr. Khetan's translation could be saved from the photocopies, although the photocopies serve a huge role in our society, where we have various stratifications, various stratas as far as our students are concerned. But I really hope this book is saved. So Christine, this appeal is also to you. Please help us. And thank you, both of you ladies, for bringing this point out, because translation and its reception, translator plays a very important role. We have two very prominent translators from India here, in Arunavada and in Monica ji, because they are opening up so many windows as far as Bengali literature is concerned, Hindi literature is concerned. So I think hats off to you guys for doing what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Marine?
Sorry. Thank you, Aditi. I think I agree with you. It's very important to keep the first translation into the discussion, and then when we have the second translation to think dialectically, because in fact it allows us to think about translation studies and the work of a translator. It is now accepted that a translator does not only find lexical equivalences between one language and another. It is accepted and known that the translator is a bridge between two different cultures, importing into one data from another. So the role is crucial, although as a situated and gender subject, the translator cannot divest himself or herself of cultural and ideological impregnations. And I think it's very interesting to think about this. And the work of thinking the two different translations was done for the English translation, and I really hope it will be done for the Hindi translation too.
Thank you. I think on that note, we shall reluctantly bring this discussion to a close. As Divya said, there was a whole new avenue that we have not even set foot on, but perhaps we can do that another evening. Yes, Mari.
So, sorry, just a quick word, if I may, because we are all huge fans of Simone de Beauvoir. Well, but I just want to say a few words as the communication coordinator of the International Simone de Beauvoir Society, and I'll be quick. If I may, you can visit our website, and from there join us on social media. We're trying to build a community around Beauvoir, and it's thank you, Christine, for putting this together, because it's a huge stone for this community, and I'm writing the link on the chat so you can join us on social media and continue the conversation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, and thank you everybody. It's a pity that we couldn't actually, some of us were lucky enough to chat with Sylvie earlier, but I'm sure we can have another session another time where we will be able to talk to her in person. Over to you, Christine.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. And again, sorry, and Sylvie Lebon de Beauvoir was really absolutely sorry because her connection was very bad, but she said that she was with all of us. Thank you so much, all the panelists, and thank you, Arunava. We didn't have, I think we had a lot of fiction questions, but unfortunately we have no time to answer to everyone. But I can say thank you, Marine, thank you for the debate, thank you so much, thank you for your amazing answer, Divya, etc. So congratulations to everyone, and Aditi, hope the Inseparables will be translated in Hindi in the coming months or later. But for sure, the French Book Office with Pape Tagore will help you and all the publishers who want to translate in any all Indian languages, English included, the French stuff. Philosopher, historian, thank you, Marine, for joining us. Thank you, Monica Singh. And again, thank you, Arunava, as moderator, and translators and authors. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Merci
Bye-bye.
beaucoup.
Merci.
Merci Marine, au revoir.
Au revoir, à bientôt.